Well, hello everyone. I am that Weems guy here for episode 21 or 22, I think it is. I'll look that up and put it in the title. Joining me tonight is Shane Gosa. And I got to tell you, I'm shocked because Shane was on time. I thought I was going to have to send a team to kidnap him and get him in front of his computer for us to do this episode. But he actually texted me a few minutes before the time we were supposed to start. So I'm in a little bit of a state of shock tonight that Shane was on time. I first met Shane, I believe, at the tactical conference in 2014, at which time he was doing a presentation on Cooper's color codes. And I sat in on that lecture. And then afterwards, he introduced himself, and we've been friends ever since. And Shane, say hello to everybody.
Hey everybody, how are y'all?
Uh, Shane has a very interesting background, as that he has basically grown up in this whole so-called tactical world, whatever application world, whatever you want to call it. He started as a teenager in a very historical place and made a lot of very interesting lifelong connections that go back to some of the big names in firearms history. Shane, uh, first tell everybody a little bit about yourself and how you got started on this path.
Like Lee said, my name's Shane Gosa, and I have been a police officer, peace officer in Georgia since I was 18 years old. In Georgia, you can do that and carry a gun at 18 as long as by your 18th birthday you've graduated the police academy. So for the last 22 years, I've been a sworn peace officer in Georgia. Still do that part time. Currently, I work for a company doing sales, and I've got a bunch of other jobs and whatnot. But started training formally in firearms when I was 15 years old and have been doing it ever since. And so I've got a lot of training and a lot of classes from a lot of different places. And I think that's what Lee and I are going to get into here just shortly.
All right. Now, as I remember, your grandfather was OSS. Is that correct?
He was. So he had, and we'll see as it progresses, he had a completely different view on a lot of stuff than some of the training I've had. He didn't talk a lot about it until he got older and was
All
in his last few years, but he was assigned to the cabinet war rooms for a while during World War II. He did some stuff out in the countryside, accompanied Churchill on some joint stuff with him and the RAF.
For those of you that are not familiar, OSS was the precursor to the modern CIA. That's correct.
Yes, sir.
Uh-huh. All right. So when you were 15, you found out about a guy named Jeff Cooper, and then you wanted to take training with him, and your grandfather took you to train.
It was, yes, sir. So it actually started before that, and I don't know that you and I have ever talked about that, but
Mm.
um, I started developing interest in firearms and whatnot when I was around 12.
Okay.
And my father had a friend that was a weapons sergeant with the 7th Special Forces Group. And so he started taking me to the range, and basically that was just marksmanship and gun safety and whatnot. He was a big point shooter, instinctive shooting, whatever you want to call it. And so I had a little bit of experience with him in that aspect of it, which got me more interested into guns and started, of course, looking at the supermarkets, finding magazines and whatnot, and came across Guns and Ammo. And in the back of Guns and Ammo every month, there was Cooper's Corner. And Cooper's Corner was the snippets of something called Gunsite Gossip, which Jeff Cooper wrote every month and published to family members or people that had been to Orange Gunsite or had received training from him somewhere else or his friends and relations. So he put out this newsletter and mail it out every month. And Guns and Ammo, because he was the editor at large of that magazine, would take snippets of this and they would publish it. And so I started reading his Cooper's Corner and found out who this Jeff Cooper guy was, and found out he had books. And so the very first book of his I ever bought was called To Ride, Shoot Straight, and Speak the Truth. And this was in the mid 90s, and he'd already sold Gunsight to someone else, and there'd been some issues with that. And he he still lived at the Sconce, which was his house on Gunsite Ranch, but he was barred from the ranges and teaching there. So I had called out, actually at 15, I had called out to Gunsite and asked about training with Jeff Cooper, and they told me he was retired and that he didn't teach anymore. He didn't have anything to do with that. And then a few months later, in the back of Guns and Ammo in Cooper's Corner, there was a little ad that said, "Hey, you can train with Jeff Cooper. Call this number," so on and so forth. So I called the number and found out that he was teaching classes at the NRA's Whittington Center. And he was basically teaching two types of classes. One was general pistol, which would be the Gunsite 250, and the other was general rifle, which would be the Gunsite 270. And so I wanted to go train with him. And so at 15 years old, my grandfather, they told me that, if you're not 8 or not 21, you have to have an adult accompany you. So my grandfather said, "Yes, I'll take you out there." And that's a story in and of itself. I knew from reading Cooper that the best handgun in the world was a 1911 45. And so I had to have a 1911 to go out there and train with him. And I didn't have a 1911. I had pretty much had experience with a Ruger Mark II, Smith & Wesson Model 19 Combat Magnum, a few various other revolvers, and SIG P220 Classic 45. So my father and I went to a gun store and we got a Springfield mil spec 1911 A1. And I knew that I couldn't just take that out there because there were some things the gun needed, such as sights you could see and a trigger you could manage, and dehorning job and complete reliability. So I decided that I needed to have that gun modified. So from reading these gun magazines, I figured, hey, Novak's is the best 45 shop in the world. I'm going to send my gun there. And I just read an article on a gun that Joe Bonar had worked on. And Joe Bonar at the time was the head of the Novak's 45 shop. So at 15 years old, I called up to Parkersburg, West Virginia, and said, "Hey, I need to speak to Mr. Bonar." And he says, "He's speaking. What do you need?" And I said, "Well, I got a 45 and I need some work done on it. And I want this, and this." And he said, "Okay, kid, send it to me and I'll get to work on it." I said, "Well, I need it back in a month." And he started laughing at me. He said, "Kid, I build guns for the special forces. I build them for the FBI. I do all this. What makes you think I'm going to turn a gun around to you in a month when I've got a year and a half wait on them?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to train with Jeff Cooper." And he got quiet and he said, "When?" And I told him, he said, "Send it to me. I'll have it back to you." He did a full house custom in 2 weeks, and I still have that gun. So he sent that back to me. And my grandfather and I flew out to Texas and to get to New Mexico. And we flew into maybe Amarillo. The colonel had a guy by the name of Tom, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his last name. Is Tom Russell. Tom Russell. Tom Russell was a preacher, and he was teaching for Jeff Cooper at the time. So Tom Russell actually met us at Amarillo, and my grandfather never had credit cards. He paid for everything in cash and checks. And he decided that we were going to rent a car. Well, the rental agency would not rent us a car without a credit card. So we had no idea what to do. Tom Russell actually let us use his credit card to rent a car. Never met us before in his entire life. And he gave us his credit card to rent a car. We got our car and we drove on out to Whittington Center, which is outside of Raton, New Mexico. And there's probably about 20 people in the class. I remember there's a Green Beret in it. And I remember that there was a high-ranking U.S. Marshal from the Pennsylvania Territory in it, a bunch of other people in it. And at that class, the colonel had Larry Larson, who was an old gun sight instructor that was helping him. And he had a guy named Doug Knox, and he had Tom Russell and a few other guys. So I went through the colonel's class at 15 out at the Whittington Center, which would basically be the Gunsite 250. And that's where I formally learned how to shoot with a 1911 45. And I got to corresponding with the colonel by letters. And one of the things a lot of people don't know about the colonel is he didn't own a computer. That might be obvious, but he never owned a computer, but he didn't write letters. He didn't type letters. He didn't write books. He didn't type any of this stuff. What he did was he had a dictaphone and he would record everything and then he would give it to his secretary and his secretary would then type everything out. Something else people may not have known, but Jeff Cooper had his own dictionary because Webster's did not have the correct definition in it for some of the words, and they also did not have certain words that existed that he created. So he had his own dictionary that his secretary used to proofread his letters and books. And so I kept corresponding with the colonel, and through that, he put me on to some other instructors, such as Louis Arbuck. I wanted to learn shotgun the same year that I learned pistol from him. And he said, I don't do shotgun. I just do rifle and pistol. If you want to learn shotgun, go to Louis Arbuck. He's the best in the world. And so when I was 15 years old, this time my father drove me to North Carolina. And I went through a shotgun class with Louis Arbuck. And the colonel and I kept corresponding back and forth, back and forth. And then I guess around 2000, Buzz Mills had bought Gunsite and the colonel was back on staff. So myself and a good friend of mine who is passed now that used to be the chief of Americus, James Green, drove from Americus, Georgia to Gunsite. And he took something called the Senior Law Enforcement Executive Program, which was basically something they had for people that made decisions at agencies. And it was 2 days pistol, 2 days carbine, 1 day shotgun, and it was free. If you provided travel, lodging, and ammo and food, they give you the class for free so that they could get the Gunsite doctrine back to agency. So James took that and I took the 270 General Rifle. And I visited with the colonel a little bit then. And then around 03, 04, when he was getting up in years some more, and we'd started corresponding even more back and forth via letter, I said I was going to go out there. And so I went out to Gunsite for about 3 or 4 months that time, the next time. And I just basically lived out there and I took 350 intermediate, 499 advanced, 270 general rifle again, took 223 basic carbine, 5.56 advanced carbine, took carbine tactical problems, I think concealed weapons and some other stuff. And then after that, I'd go back and visit him from time to time. And then after he passed away, I went out and saw Mrs. Cooper from time to time. Another part of all of this history that I don't think you and I have ever talked about was after I trained with the colonel, but before I trained with Louis Arbuck, I took a class at Front Sight back when it was in Bakersfield, California. And at the time, Mark Fleischman, who was an LAPD guy, was on staff, but the head of training there was Chuck Taylor. And Chuck Taylor has an old history with Gunsite, and he and the colonel in Gunsite had parted ways when he formed the American Small Arms Academy. But I'd read Chuck Taylor's books too, and to a degree, I wanted to go take his class as well. And so he would give a lecture, and basically he was holding court after he got through with the firearms stuff. You go listen to Chuck Taylor, and everybody'd sit there and listen to his stories and whatnot. And he used to, before he carried the Glock 17, he made famous for shooting hundreds of thousands of rounds. He carried a Colt Commander. I don't remember if it was a lightweight Commander or a combat Commander. I just remember it was in 45, and he had a finish on it called Metalloy. I think it was SS Chromium M, but it was made by a company called Metalloy. And at the time, my 1911 was blued, and I was looking for a different finish for it. And I asked him if he had that, and he whipped it out from under his safari vest and handed it to me, and I dropped his pistol in front of everybody. So I dropped Chuck Taylor's pistol, and he just stared at me and handed it back to him. And he was giving his lecture then, and somebody asked him a question: "What's the finest assault rifle?" This was back in the 90s, mid 90s, and he said, "What's the finest assault rifle in the world?" And Chuck said, it's the AK-47. So here I am, 15 years old, raise my hand. Yes. Well, what about the Galil? And he stared at me and said, well, yeah, that's a better gun, but it's not quite as common. Okay. So then somebody asked him a question about what was the best round for a shotgun to use in heavy brush. And he said, oh, well, that would be this type of buckshot. So I raised my hand. He looked at me and said, what? I said, what about flechettes? And he stared at me and said, who are you? And I said, well, I've read all your books. And he just kind of stared at me because all this was in his books, you know. But that was my interaction with Chuck Taylor. Now, when I went back to Gunsite, the colonel, I was taking a 270 General rifle, and the colonel called me up to his house and said, well, what are you going to shoot in this class? And I said, oh, I'm going to shoot a Springfield M1A Scout. And he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. He said, a what? And I said, a Springfield M1A Scout. And he said, bring that in there. And so I brought it in and looked at him, and he looks at it and said, this is not a Scout, because it was a semi-automatic and it couldn't make weight and whatnot. And he said, this won't do. You can't shoot that. Go to the armory and get Sweetheart. And Sweetheart was the prototype. It's Sweetheart 2 actually was the prototype to the Scout rifles. And he said, you're going to shoot that in the class. And I'm like, okay. So I go downstairs to the armory and I get Sweetheart out. And I said, well, I need a sling. And he said, well, there's a sling down there. You know, it just wasn't attached to it because he would put his rifles up on the wall and they had a display. So I went and got a sling, and they had very, it's kind of strange to describe them, but there were Packmer hammerhead swing swivels. So basically you took is a little reverse T thing, and you take it and put it into the stock of the rifle and twist it, and it would hold in place. And it was a swing swivel. And then to take it off, you just twist it and pull it out. So I take that and I go back to the place that I was staying, which was right next door to him at the time. And I go to assemble the sling on the thing, and I'm all happy. I'm like, oh, I got the prototype of the Scout rifle. Well, I proceed to mess it up and break the swing swivel. Literally snapped it in two, and I'm just staring at him like, it'll be okay because it's got 3 swivels on here, so I can just use 2 and use it as a regular sling. So I go to put the next one in, and I break that in 2 as well. And so I'm sitting here staring at the Scout rifle, and I'm like, at least I didn't break the gun. And so I drive back up to the colonel's house, and he looks at me. He's like, what are you doing back? And I said, well, I broke your sling. And he kind of stared at me, and he looked at that, and he said, they haven't made these in years. And I'm like, yeah, can I have the last one I didn't break, and I'll have some more fabricated? And he was like, okay. He said, well, I guess you're not using that rifle. And I'm like, no, sir. And he said, okay, go downstairs and get the Blaser. And he had just gotten a Blaser 93, which was a unique rifle, had a straight pull on the bolt. And there's not a sear in the gun. It's hard to describe, but he was very enamored with that gun because of the way the trigger worked. And it was a excellently crafted rifle. So I got that, and it had like some $4,000 Schmidt and Bender scope on it. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, I just broke sling swivels, and now I've got Jeff Cooper's Blaser 93. I'm going to mess this up. And so I was worried to death about that. Called my father and sent him the sling swivel, and he actually custom fabricated a bunch of them based off of that. And we sent them back to the colonel, but obviously I couldn't have it done in a week. So I go off to class with the Blaser 93. And some of the gun sight instructors that knew what they were doing were like, where'd you get that rifle? I'm like, oh, that's the colonel's. And they're staring at me like, oh, this is going to be great, you know? So we start shooting, and probably about day 2 of the class, I started having the action bind. So you don't come up and back and then push it forward. You just literally pull it back and forth. Well, it started binding, and we couldn't figure out what was going on. So I had to drive up from the range, go back to the sconce, walk in. Mrs. Cooper's like, hey, Shane, it's not lunch. What are you doing here? And I'm like, I broke the colonel's rifle. And she said, another one? And I said, yes, ma'am. She said, well, Jeff's up in his office. So I climb up the spiral staircase, go up to the top, and the colonel's, you know, dictating out a letter or a book or whatever he was working on at the time. And he said, "What's wrong with the rifle?" And I'm scared to death at this point. But I said, "Well, Colonel, it's binding." He said, "Show me." And I was explaining it to him. And he said, "Okay, well, put it back in the armor." He said, "I need to know these things." He said, "I'll see if I can get it worked out." And he wasn't mad at all. He was a lot different than most people thought. Um, he was not as hard. He was very heavy on doctrine, but he was not necessarily as dogmatic as people make him out to be. Um, he didn't really care um, if you shot a 1911 or a Glock. He didn't really care if you shot Weaver or isosceles. He didn't care if you shot a 9mm or 45. He preferred the Weaver. He preferred a 1911. He preferred 45, and he had reasons for that. But at the end of the day, the way he felt was, this is what works best for me. This is what works best for the students that have reported back to me. This is the way I think you should do it. These are the reasons why. If you don't want to, you don't have to. And he just didn't really care about it. Now, he did poke fun at some stuff. I think that was I think that was his sense of humor, because he had a very good sense of humor. Um, there was a several interviews Wiley Clapp did, and I wish I could. I was there when he did them off camera, and I wish I could see if those ever got published or not. This was back again between 03, 04. It was prior to the internet taking off, so to speak.
Which, let's
And
bring up that point here for a second. All of this association started from ads in the back of magazines and actual letter correspondence. It's not like now, like we're talking over video phone, or you could just send emails. Like you had to put a letter in the mail. I know it takes 3 or 4 days for a letter to get from Georgia to Arizona.
it used to
The
take
whole process.
four
Yeah.
4 business days, because I actually got to where I would time it
Yeah.
and knew when I was going to send one and how long it would take him if he was there to respond back to me. So at the time, it took 4 days to get a letter to Arizona. It would take me 2 days to drive out there. I would start from Georgia, and halfway between where I am in Georgia to Gunsite is Shamrock, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So I would drive for almost 18 hours, get to Shamrock, Texas, spend the night, get up and drive to Gunsite. But yeah, it started in the back of a magazine. Jeff Cooper did not have a computer. He did not have a cell phone. Mrs. Cooper had a cell phone, but it was turned off. So when I say that, it was fully charged. It was one of those little Nokia brick phones,
Mm-hmm.
and it was fully charged, and she kept it in her purse, but it wasn't turned on. It was only for an emergency. So if you wanted to get in touch with him, you'd have to either write him or have his home phone number and call him. They did have caller ID, because they would screen the calls, and he did have a answering machine, but it was an answering machine that had a tape in it.
Yeah.
So, and he had 3 TVs. He had a little small one in the kitchen that he would watch the news on. He had a larger screen TV down in the entertainment room. So you went down the steps in his house, and you had the wine cellar, you had storage, you had the library, then you had the game room, entertainment room, which had a pool table and TV, and then you had his armory off to the right from there. And so then he had one in his bedroom back when he got older, because he couldn't move out of it so much. But the only thing I ever saw him watch was the news right before dinner, and then he and I watched 2 movies together. One was a racing movie, and one was a movie about fencing. So, like, fighting with fencing foils and whatnot. And I don't remember the names of them, but I've got them written down on a bunch of stuff at this in the safe at home that has the dates we did this, the date, and what. So what I would do is, once we discuss stuff, I'd go back to my room, and because a lot of the time I stayed with him at the sconce, so I'd go back to my room and I would write out, this is the date, this is what we talked about, this is what Jeff Cooper said about this, because I figure at some point it was historical. At some
Right.
point that was going to mean something, and it meant a lot to me at the time, still does. But that's all in the safe at the house. So anytime we would do something, I'd write down what we did for reference later. Like, I got a copy of all the books he had in his library. because I went down there one day and wrote down all the titles of the books and stuff, and I was helping him organize it and whatnot. But it's somewhere. But yeah, he barely watched TV at all. And this was back when every month you waited to go get a magazine from the newsstand, when they still had guns and ammo, guns, handguns, American handgunner, SWAT, all that. And so, you kind of got SWAT for Louis Auerbach's articles, and you got guns and ammo for Jeff Cooper's articles, and you got American Handgunner for the pictures of the really cool guns and everything else. And the other combat handguns I got for the articles. Yeah. And that was kind of the way I broke it down every month.
Now, when you were taking these classes at Gunsite, who were some of the range masters and assistant instructors?
So and I'm going to get the numbers wrong somewhat. 350, the range master was Pat Rogers. 499, it was Ed Head, and Randy Kane was a assistant instructor. And meeting Randy Kane out there, Randy Kane to me is a protege of Louis Auerbach's. He and Louis were very good friends, and Louis, who actually got Randy into the business, if I remember correctly. But Randy is one of his fortes is he does diagnostics better than anybody else that I know of. He can look across the range of a line of students and pick out what each and every one of them is doing wrong or could improve on. He's very humble.
For our audience, Randy Kane operates Cumberland Tactics. You can find them online at guntactics.com. I know he teaches a lot in the Lakeland, Florida area, but he travels. I know he does stuff in Pittsburgh and Michigan, and he's got some other classes coming along. He's one of the guys that I really want to get on the range with. Our schedules just never seem to mix. But I wanted to point our audience to where they could find him while we were talking about him. So go ahead, Shane.
Yes, sir. So I met Randy out there, and I think Randy was also I think he was in the 270 class I did out there as well, but I don't remember on that. But I ended up taking some classes from him in the Atlanta area and maybe Florida over the years. And so then in 223, that class was Giles Stock, the famous Stock brothers. Ed, his brother, was still working for an OGA at the time, and I think he had just gotten back, and he came on range, but he didn't actually teach. That was Giles or Giles. 556, the range master was either Pat Rogers, I think it was Pat, and Jeff Gonzalez might have been an assistant for him, or either Jeff Gonzalez might have been the range master for carbine tactical problems, but he was in one of those two. And then in 270, that's another Jeff Cooper story. 270, because it wasn't a Cooper or a Master Series class, but because I was in it, Jeff Cooper was coming to the range to make sure that I was doing correctly and whatnot. So the tricycle would fire up, and you'd hear it at the sconce, and he'd come zipping down there, and everybody'd be like, "What is he doing?" And I'm like, "It's my fault. He's coming to see me." And one of his trips, he brought John Ganaway, and John Ganaway was one of the colonel's good friends. He was called the Line Man because of how many lines he had taken in Africa. He's an expert rifleman. And he came down there, and I think I was more nervous of being watched by John Ganaway than I was Jeff Cooper, because John Ganaway is a very imposing individual, very nice, very professional, but he's very imposing. And I knew that on this particular drill, we were at 50 yards, and it was standing to sitting one round to the 8-inch circle of the option target. And this is with a bolt gun. And I think this class I was using a Steyr Scout in it. And so Ganaway came down and was standing over my shoulder, and I was as nervous as I could be. And I went to sitting, and I fired a perfect headshot. And he looks down range from 50 yards and he says, that's a really good shot. And I'm like, well, thank you, sir. He said, but that's not where we were told to shoot now, is it? And I'm like, oh, just crushed, and he turns around and leaves. So I've experienced that with three people. The colonel, nervous as I could be when he was standing over my shoulder watching me shoot, John Ganaway, and then Tom Gibbons. Tom did that to me in a shotgun class. I was doing fine until he walked up behind me, and then I was just all over the place. Everybody else I could really care less. They've never bothered me, but those three have gotten me on the range. They've actually produced more fear than somebody pointing a pistol at me.
I've seen Tom make somebody's gun malfunction just through sheer will. He did it to
I can believe that.
He did it to Tim Chandler one time when Tim was shooting, I think, a Wilson Combat 1911 in 9mm. And
that's why it malfunctioned.
And Tom walked up to him and said something. Well, I'm amazed that 1911 and 9mm hasn't malfunctioned yet. And Tim said, "Oh, it's been working great." And on the very next presentation from the holster and a scored course of fire, it malfunctions. It's like it was amazing that he could, just had that power just to do that.
Now that you say that, I've had every Tom Gibbons class I've gone to, I've had a problem with a gun. First one I ever went to was Craig Douglas, Ed Lovett, and Tom Gibbons, called Total Spectrum Defense. It was at the old Memphis facility. Tom did pistol, Lovett did snub nose revolver and surveillance, counter surveillance, and Craig, back when he was South NARC and was still operational as a peace officer, did his unarmed stuff. And at the time, I was carrying a Kimber that actually worked. I want to say that Chuck Rogers had done some work on it at the time, but it was a 4-inch bull-barreled Kimber bushingless with an aluminum frame. And it ran and ran and ran like a top. And I had it in a thumb brake holster, concealed thumb brake holster. And everything's going fine. Every draw, I'd secure the retention device, and I'd draw from the thumb brake every time. Tom comes up to me, and he's standing behind me, and I go to draw, and the gun will not come out of the holster. I literally had to take the holster out of my belt and cut the strap off of it because it just would not come out. I think it was an advanced, it was either an basic instructor or advanced instructor class I go to, and we're shooting a bullseye target. And my group's all over the paper. And he walks up behind me, and I realize at some point when I'm checking targets checking the target between strings, something's going on here. So I went to check my sights. My rear sights moving back and forth. In the rear channel is a 3rd generation Glock 19, and the sight would literally just drift back and forth in the channel. And so I'm doing the best I can. And because I knew better than to, unless it was a safety violation, I wasn't going to stop or interrupt him during that class. I was just going to wait until he came up to me, and then I'd go switch the guns out and stuff. So he comes up to me and says, "What's wrong with your gun?" I said, "My rear sight's loose." He said, "I can tell," and just walked off. And I'm like, so I don't know if he knew that the rear sight was really loose, or if he was just saying my shooting was that bad. That had to have been it, Yeah. But it's unique to see certain guns not work. 1911s have a bad reputation in internet years of not being reliable, and to a degree, you've got. I don't go into the whole philosophy of it has to be X number of bullet, X number of magazine, and it has to be fitted this way, and it has to be this. I don't go into all that, but I do agree that it has to be a quality gun. And it does have to have some quality parts, does have to have a quality magazine, quality ammunition, stuff like that. Basic minor work to 1911s, if it's a quality gun, in my experience at least, and I probably had 40 or 50 of them, but if it's in around the $1,200 mark, $12 to $1,800 mark, as long as I'm using a quality manufacturer, quality parts, and decent ammo, decent magazines. I have not had the problems with 1911. Some have. Now, I have had 1911. I've had one 1911 that cost $6,000, and I couldn't get it to work to save my life. Sent it back multiple times, and just couldn't get it to work. I've had some Kimbers that I couldn't get to work, but yet I've had other Kimbers that were flawless just straight out of the box. So I think it's kind of a hit or miss. Do I think that modern polymer guns are more reliable? Again, it depends. But if we're going to look at the numbers of what's out there versus the other, probably for your average shooter, somebody that doesn't want to stay on top of spring changes and stuff like that, then yeah, you're probably better off with a polymer gun that's new manufactured, because you're going to have less problems out of it than you would a 1911. But this goes back to, I am probably aged more than my physical years, being a curmudgeon and whatnot, because again, I started reading articles in magazines and clipping out stuff to call somebody on the phone to go to training. So I kind of expected to do more. You've got people that don't clean the guns after every range trip, whatnot. And that Green Beret, going back to the beginning, that was friends with my father, if we went to the range, I cleaned that gun in the field at the range before we could leave. I could not leave with a dirty gun. So I got in that habit. If it was a magazine, I field stripped that gun and I cleaned it. I at least wiped it down, and relubricated it. So that may be one of the problem, or that might be why I have not had as many problems with certain 1911s as other people. And I'm also I'm pretty strict on what kind of springs I use and everything else. And there's a little bit of a formula to it and whatnot.
And you're
that I
still
think is
carrying a
maybe
1911 on duty, aren't you?
it depends, but most of the time, yes.
In a
But
Safari Land 070 holster that a very talented gun guy gave to
that
you.
you did. You gave me a leather 070 triple retention holster. And for people that don't know what that is, when you grip the gun, your thumb breaks a thumb break, your middle finger pops back another button, then you rock the gun back so it removes the lock out of the ejection port, then you can draw.
Yeah.
And then when you reholster, you still have to pop that first button, then pop the thumb strap.
Yep. Well, if you're going to
So
carry an anachronistic pistol, you got to carry it in an anachronistic holster.
that's true. I do have, and of course, I'm in a hotel right now traveling for my other job, and I don't have this with me, but I've got some original Milt Sparks. I've got Jeff Cooper's, his personal Yaki slide. I've got a #1 AT competition rig that has Jeff Cooper's crest on the front of it, which is JC, and a pin and a sword, because the pin is mightier than the sword. And on the back, you can see where it was made by Milt Sparks, and it's stamped TK for Tony that built the holster, and then it's stamped JC for Jeff Cooper. And I have also, the way I got that Yaki slide was I had called Milt Sparks, because that's what Jeff Cooper carried, and that's what I wanted. And I called Milt Sparks, and I spoke with Mr. Tony, and he said, we don't make those. And I said, well, the Colonel's got a new one. And he said, yeah, I'll make them for Jeff Cooper, but I don't make them for anybody else. They're not a catalog item. And I was kind of perplexed. I was like, well, I wonder why I can't have one, So I wrote the Colonel, and I said, hey, I want a Yaki slide, but I can't find one, and Milt Sparks won't build me one. And I said, do you have any recommendations? And he wrote back, you can always check the gun shows. And then he put, I have 2 of them, but I only use one at a time. I didn't think anything else of it. So the next time I go out there to stay with him, he said, go into your bedroom. There's a present on the bed, and there is a Milt Sparks Yaki slide in a brand new plastic bag. And he said, I only have 2. I can only wear one. So you have that one. So I'm wearing that around Gunsite. and I wasn't there for a class. I was just out there to visit him. And Gunsight, when Jeff Cooper originally bought it, he bought extra land, and that was called Raven Guard. And so Raven Guard were empty 40-acre lots, and he would sell them to instructors, family members, so on and so forth. But the idea was, here's Gunsight, and Raven Guard is all around it. So he had a barrier between his shooting property and neighbors. So neighbors or anti-gun people couldn't come in and buy up the property and then zone him out. So he developed these little plots, and he called it Raven Guard. And so when I would go out there to visit, if I wasn't taking a class from Gunsight, I would go to Jeff Cooper's private range to shoot. And it was called the Cooper Range. And it was pretty much the first plot of land on the left. Once you drive pat, here's the Gunsight main building, and you can go here and that way to the ranges, but there's another road that keeps going straight, and that goes back into Raven Guard. And some of the older instructors still live out there. I believe my mind's going blank now. He owned Bill Jeans. Bill Jeans used to have a place out there when Pat Rogers was alive. He had a place out there. He didn't have a house on it, but he would literally had an old World War II Willys Jeep, and he would camp out there, literally camp in a tent, just like it was Vietnam. And he'd get up every day, and he would run with a Colt Car 15, one of those pencil barreled 2-position telescopic metal stocks, and he would do his run and PT and stuff out there with that. Then go over to the office, take a shower, do his class and whatnot. But he would stay out there on his property. But you had other people that had property out there, and so you had Jeff Cooper's range, and it had a range shack, had targets, steel targets, target frames, all this stuff in it. So the way it would work is I go out there and I want to shoot, and I want to shoot the colonel's guns, whether it was his Bren 10 or a rifle or my pistol or whatever. I'd go out there and shoot, but I'd have to go to the front office. You walk in and you'd see Jane Ann, who's still out there, and she does all the media for them now. Very nice lady. But you go out there and, hey, I'm going to the Cooper range to shoot, and they give you a radio, and you drive over to the Cooper range, and you'd run a red flag up to the top of it. You get on the radio, and you'd say Cooper range is hot, and they would acknowledge Cooper range is hot. Then you could shoot on it. Then when you get through with it, you'd run the flag back down, get on the radio. Cooper range is cold. They'd acknowledge you, take the radio back to Gunsight. Well, at the time, the operations manager out there was Bob Young. Bob Young was a colonel of Marines, and he was a Mustang. So he'd worked his way up from, basic school to a literal colonel. And he is the guy that created and ran the fast units. And he had a very big gun sight background and whatnot, of course, with Jeff Cooper. And so Buzz Mills had hired him as the operations manager, and he's walking around every day with a Colt Commander and a Yaki slide on a Milt Sparks belt and everything. And so I come bebopping up to the office one day, and he looks at me and says, you need something to go with that holster. And I'm like, yes, sir. And so he goes back in his office, and he comes back out, and he's got a plastic bag, and inside of that he has a magazine pouch, and it's a dual mag pouch. And hold on one second, as luck would have it, he has a dual magazine pouch. Now this was 2 of them put together, and you cut it straight down the middle, and then you could make singles. So this is actually one of the ones I got from it. It was made by Milt Sparks, and that was their little leather. And it's hard to describe, but it's a plastic, and it's got a basket weave stamp on it. It's for a 1 3/4 inch, and you can't really see down in there, maybe, but there we go. You can see I'll get it in a second. That's kind of awkward, but you can kind of see that there are ridges right there, and then up at the top. And so what those are is they keep the magazine off the body,
Right.
and it allows water to drain out the bottom, and it allows less friction. And so you can just, simply just come out, but you can turn it upside down and it's not going to come out. So it's resistant to mildew, heat, moisture, everything else there is. It's the best magazine pouch that's ever made. And if you look at Tango Down, Larry Vickers actually had them recreate this pouch. And you can get it, I think, in black and FDE, but it's just for like Glock 17s and 19s. But there's no sharp corners. It's lightweight. This thing has to be from the 80s. And I've been using it for 16 years and it still looks like that. So that's a little piece of forgotten trivia history, but yeah, I still carry that. This is where I carry a spare. I carry two 1911 spare mags, and they are carried in, one of them is in a Price Western leather single pouch that Dennis Martin of CQB Services from England gave me. And the other is in a mid 1990s Blade Tech single mag pouch that has a Gunsite Raven embossed on it that I got at the pro shop. And they're still going strong from, the 90s. So it depends on what it is. Quality gear works real well. I've got a duty holster for a full-size 1911. It's a Safariland 6280. It's the SLS roll top. Yeah. That was Craig Douglas's, and he gave that to me. So if I've got a full-size 1911, I can carry it in that. I am still using the same 1911 Jeff Cooper taught me how to shoot with. It has had over 300,000 rounds through it. It has had a blued finish, SS Chromium M metal alloy finish that Chuck Taylor recommended. And after I dropped his gun and saw it didn't scratch it, I got one. I wore that off of it, and it's currently on an NP3 frame with a Rogard slide, and the NP3 is worn through. Yeah. I have shot out the Springfield barrel, a Wilson Combat barrel, and it's on an Ed Brown barrel now. And I have shot out 6 set of internals on it, and the frame has been cracked and rewelded, and the thing still runs and runs.
All right, before we get away from the gun sight thing, you used a couple of terms I would like to clarify for the audience, for those that aren't versed on it. You mentioned Orange Gun Sight, and that was the original API, American Pistol Institute, that Cooper founded, and then he sold it. And is that era is referred to a gray gun sight? Is that correct?
It is, yes, sir.
And then Buzz Mills bought the property back, and it came back to
simply gun sight.
And it's back into but gun sight people came back and are running it now.
Yes, sir.
Under Mr.
So
Mills.
76 to 93, 92, 93. The Raven, the signs and everything were brown with orange on them. Mm-hmm. When the Colonel sold it in 92 or 93, he was still there for about a year. And the owner at the time had a disagreement with him and banned him from teaching, banned him from the ranges. And the problem with that was that when you get on, number one, the problem with it is Jeff Cooper is Gunsite. Yeah. That is all there is to it. So once you drive through the gate, you have to your right an instructor housing complex. Then behind that, you have the campground, which actually started off life as an airfield. Then up on the hill, you have the sconce, which is the Colonel's house. Then behind that, you had the gunsmithy and the classroom, or the pro shop, the classroom, and then the main offices. So to get to the Colonel's house, you literally have to drive onto Gunsite. There's no way to his house unless you go straight through Gunsite. So it created a sort of an issue because he'd banned the Colonel from teaching and from the ranges, yet the Colonel had to live on Gunsite because part of the agreement was that the Colonel and Mrs. Cooper would live there as long as they were alive. So that was part of the agreement of the sale of it, And so from around 93 to 1999, 2000, the colonel did not teach at Gunsite. If he taught several classes at Thunder Ranch for Clint Smith. He taught at the NRA's Whittington Center, and he did a few other things during that time frame as well, but he did not teach at Gunsite. So as soon as the new owner took it, he repainted the signs and he painted them gray. So it was a simple way for them to differentiate between what era gun site you went to, because the new owner between 93 and 2000 had changed the doctrine, had started doing different things. Now, I'll grant him this: he had some world class instructors during that time. Harry Humphreys was out there, Chris Karachi, Herschel Davis, a handful of really hardcore, been there, done that guys that did a lot of excellent instruction. Bill Jeans, Jack Furr. Bill Jeans went on to do Morgan Consulting. Jack Furr went on to teach for Clint Smith at Thunder Ranch, and so on and so forth. So he had some good instructors. He just changed the doctrine away from what the colonel did and whatnot. And so as soon as Buzz Mills came in, the place had been run down, and Buzz Mills really, he's a nice guy. He's always been very nice to me and was always very accommodating with me. But he realized Jeff Cooper was Gunsite, so he dumped over $1 million into it, revitalized it, and then brought the colonel back in. So it's not a, and it's not a necessarily Weaver 1911 school. They teach a version of the Weaver now, from what I understand, and you'll see Glock 9mm in the instructors' holsters and whatnot like that. What I think that they still do better than anyone else, to my knowledge, is the length of the class and the structure they have. So the 5-day class, you want to go for basic handgun, the 5-day 250 and stay there for, and this is not a Gunsite advertisement, but the history of it, you can go out there, take 5 days and then never go back, as long as you practice what you had there. But you want to build on that, you go back for another 5 days, and you do your 350, and that's your intermediate pistol. And then you go back for another 5 days and you do your 499, and that's your doctorate degree. That's your advanced pistol. But you've got to have somebody that is willing to dedicate themselves to going out there, willing to keep up with the practice, willing to, if you go through 250, 350, 499, by the time you get through with lodging, meals, food, all that, you're well into 15 grand at this point in time. And there are not a lot of people that have that. I still think it's a wonderful idea if you can actually do it. And that's why I've made the comment, if you've got somebody that's got an e-ticket or expert from 499, I'll put them up against anybody in the world as far as their skills go for defensive pistol craft. But at the same time, you look at Range Master, you look at Tom Gibbons, you look at guys like him that are doing what he does, that have a traveling show, and he can take somebody in 2 or 3 days and get them up to a very good level of skill, and they're not out that money, and they didn't have to go halfway across the country to spend a week out there. So I don't disparage either one of them. I think they're both great. I think both types are great. But that was back in the 70s when he started doing this. Classes were, I think they were $400 back in the late 70s, and they were 5.5 days, Monday through Saturday. Saturday was a half day. So you'd spend $400, you go out there for 5.5 days, and it was 600 rounds of ammo. And in 5.5 days and 600 rounds of ammo, he was producing highly competent shooters. But that's all dependent on the will to actually learn. If you're going out there because you're sent, it's just like now. You can take a convenience store clerk, a 50-year-old female convenience store clerk from Athens, Georgia, and send her to Tom's basic combative pistol 1 school. And within 2 or 3 days and 600 rounds of ammo, she's going to have a really solid foundation and really good life-saving skills. And then you take a police officer and put them through a 40-hour, 5-day course, and they're just there because they have to go through it so that they can get their job. And she'll outperform that young guy that went through the academy just because of the way that they're learning. She has more of a motivation, even though you think
Mhm.
the young guy going through the 40 hours should have one. It's not always the case. But I don't disparage either school. I think both of them are great. Um, and I think if
Yeah.
anybody gets the chance, they should try both
Yeah.
types, you know.
Yeah. You do get a full immersion if you go out for like a 5-day class. That is a huge commitment in time wise and money wise to get out there. My only trip to Gunsite was for a shotgun class, and I know what it set me back. And of course, part of that was I wanted to go make the pilgrimage and go see where all of it began. And so it was worth it to me from that regard. Um, and so, if you're interested in firearms training, that's where everything that we're doing today in firearms training originated out of Gunsight. Whether it has gone on and changed over to other things, it all still goes back to all that. If you want to go back and watch or listen to the episode last week with Daryl Bulkey, it's how things spread throughout the West Coast. Well, we also talked about there really wasn't an East Coast analog to that, but it still all kind of grew out of the same era, and that same teaching that was coming out of there. Um, we've been going a little over an hour. Uh, any other Cooper anecdotes or any of the old time Gunsight anecdotes you'd like to share with our audience before we sign off?
Um, I'll think of one in just a second, but bringing up that podcast with Bulky,
Mm-hmm.
um, you had mentioned Mid South
Yeah.
in that. And tonight, I ate dinner with a guy that was Naval Special Warfare. And we got to talking, and he said, back when I went to Mid South, and I said, what? And I was like, what'd you just say? Are you
Yeah.
listening to my phone conversations or what? He's like, no, why? Like, well, my friend Lee Weems was just talking about Mid South. He was like, oh, yeah, I went back when John had just won all that stuff. So, I mean, and he was an East Coast UDT SEAL guy. So that's where he went back in, the late 80s, early 90s was there. And you go out on the West Coast, you got the West Coast SEALs going over to Gunsight and whatnot. Trying to think if there's anything else I could tell you off the top of my head.
And Shane's law enforcement training is going to be very similar to mine in that he came up through the Georgia Public Safety Training Center as well. So we have to be kind of careful when we're talking in a setting like this. We're going to be saying things that each other understands what each other is saying without having to give the context to it. But
when I went through the academy, of course, again, I'm 18. I've got a custom Novak 1911 45. And so when I went through the academy, they were heavy on Glock 22s and shooting from isosceles. And I'm out shooting a single action weapon from Weaver. And my class coordinator at the time did not like that, did not like me. And he went on to be a very powerful person in the state and retired recently, but he called me last week to ask me gun advice. So we kind of made up, but at the time to mirror off of that, they were very heavy into, they had just come off of 9s and went to 40s, and they were very heavy on to a minor caliber under 45 pistol and shooting from isosceles, and they were very against the Weaver and very against a single action weapon. So it's kind of strange because I'm taking everything that I learned and coming here as law enforcement, they're like, no, that's all wrong. Well, no, it's not. So it's kind of a bridge. And I don't care if you shoot Weaver. I don't care if you shoot isosceles. I don't care if you shoot a Glock, a SIG, 1911, a 45, a 9, a 38 special. It doesn't really matter. You make your own choice and you do whatever. Most of them are going to work. It's more of a mindset. That is one thing. If you knew the colonel, he would harp on. He didn't really care. He knew what he thought worked better, but he'd tell you in a heartbeat, 22 through the tear duct would be better than a peripheral hit with a 44. And so Mrs. Cooper, the Countess, Janelle, she had two pistols he'd trained her with. One was her working gun and the other was her presentation gun. Her working gun was a Smith & Wesson Model 60 stainless Chief Special with staghorn grips loaded with standard pressure 125 grain Federal Nyclad bullets. So that's what she'd drop in her purse to go to pick up the mail, because that's another thing about the Colonel. You wrote him, it was a P.O. box in Paulden. So it was a 20-minute one-way trip to go get the mail, because they didn't deliver out the Gunsite because the road was so bad. So that's what she would carry if she was out and about. Her presentation gun, which I've got actual old 35 millimeter footage, or not footage, but pictures of this stuff back at the house, because there weren't digital cameras when I was out there. If they were too expensive, and I'd rather spend the money on a gun than I would a digital camera at the time. Right. So, but her presentation gun was a Model 36 Chief Special. It was a royal blue polymer finish that Robbie Barkman did a one-off of, the only kind in the world. And it had, I don't remember if it was ivory or if it was Coca-Cola wood stocks on it, but it had some type of stocks on it. It had the Countess engraved in sterling silver on the side. And the reason it's called Countess is because the Colonel was the guru. And the proper title for a guru's wife is Contessa or Countess. So that's where he came up with that. So, but it had the Countess engraved in silver on the side. The front sight had 3 real diamonds embedded in the ramp. And it had the same bullets, but the bullets had diamonds embedded into the end with it. And the Colonel thought it would be very nice if a creep got shot with a diamond, so that's why it had those put into it. His carry gun, I'd seen him I'd seen him carry only 2 guns. At first, he was carrying a Springfield 1911 GI kit that was built, a GSP, Gunsite Service Pistol, built up on. In his later years, he carried a lightweight Commander. And that lightweight Commander was a 2-tone blued and then just silver frame. It had an extended thumb safety. It had Jeff Cooper's signature inlaid in gold on the top of it. Had a trigger job to it, and it had excess sights. He was friends with Ashley Emerson. So it had a V-notch rear, and it had a white dot front. No tritium. He didn't carry anything for tritium, and he had reasons for that. But that's how his pistol was set up. 4.25 inch Commander slide, lightweight Commander, 7-round frame, basic stocks, gold signature, good trigger, extended thumb safety, and then Emerson sights, excess Emerson sights. And he carried it with 230 grain Hornady, 230 grain jacketed trunicated cone Hornady, which basically, imagine a 40 caliber full metal jacket round, except the size of a 45. And that's what he carried. So I know that, he had 3 daughters, and he gave one of them, he actually gave a Star 45, the Spanish single action gun. So it's aluminum frame. It's kind of like a hybrid between a Commander officer size. And he carried it cocked and locked. But he thought a lot of those little guns, carried a lot, shot a little. And he actually, believe it or not, gave a Glock 27 for one of his daughters to carry, because it was compact, it was lightweight, it was at least 40 caliber. It wasn't a 45, but it was 40, but she could manage it and she could carry it in her purse without much trouble. So a lot of this, when I hear people say certain things about the Colonel, they didn't really know him. They know what he wrote, but they might not know how to interpret what he wrote. So he's a lot more, he wasn't as dogmatic as some people think, but that's, and the reason I know why one of them has is because when I was cleaning guns in his armory, I found a Glock box. I'm like, what is this? Oh, we gave this to this daughter. She's carrying a Glock. Well, it works. Blah blah blah. So, last two things, and I know you got to go. But if he was also very fond of two weapons if he was going to build a military. So the rifle he would choose is an HKG3, which is a 308 HK91 with a telescopic stock and a bipod with a good trigger and with a Trigicon reflex tritium fiber optic sight, non-magnified. He had one of those in his armory. He was very fond of it for a military arm. And if you go to Panteo and you look under make ready, you have to go to the Gunsite thing, and then you go over to the far right, and I think it's like make ready or something like that. It's scroll down, it's called Rifle Works. And so the first part of it is a Marine Corps class he's doing a 250 pistol for, and the second part is a Marine Corps class he's doing a 223 carbine class for. And he's got that gun in that video, and he shows with the bipod on it how you can thrust it forward as you go into prone. It'll kick the bipod out, and how you can shoot it without the stock on it and get hits on it. But that was a rifle he thought would be a good battle rifle. And then he also said if he was going to equip a modern military, he would issue them the CZ-75 9mm.
Now, would they have carried that cocked and locked or in double action mode? The CZ-75.
But what other way is there to carry but cocked and locked?
So, I had to ask.
I know. He and I could go on for days, but he had a specific system for double action as well. He had 4 different ways to deploy it. So, and you can read about that in To Ride, Shoot Straight, and Speak the Truth. And he goes into detail about how you would deploy a double action pistol. The easiest way and the way he preferred to do it was to cock it, but you've got to cock it with your thumb of your offhand. So you draw and it cocks as you're coming up. So it's not cock here, but it's grip the pistol, hands joined together, and you literally cock it as you're coming up. So that was the way he preferred to do it. That was what he thought the most user-friendly, time-saving, eloquent way to get it done was. And that actually works pretty good. You just have to be practiced with it. And even if you're very practiced, if you don't try it, if you don't practice with it weekly, you're going to miss the hammer eventually. But that was his solution to cocking it on the way up. Now, granted, double action pistols back then had a much harder trigger pull than those out today. They've got some like the Langdon Berettas and the CZ Shadows and a bunch of different ones. The trigger is much more manageable than it was back then. Back then, 12 pounds was light for the double action pull on some of the guns. So that's where that came from.
All right. We'll have to do another episode kind of like this because I've enjoyed the walk back through history. And I'm worried that so much of this information is going to be lost, because the only way to find it's actually in old magazines or letters.
It is.
And personal recollections like this. And so one of the things I hope to do with this show, as long as it keeps going, is to be able to capture some of these type things on video. And I know how much Colonel Cooper and Mrs. Cooper meant to you. And I do appreciate you coming on tonight and sharing this with the audience, because you and I have had these conversations a lot of times in person or on the phone. And I really wanted to get some of this documented for the ages.
Thank you, sir. I promised Wayne Dobbs, I don't know what range master conference it was, but he got up with conviction. I mean, it was like he was in a Southern Baptist church and he was, speaking over me. He's told me, you've got to get this out where somebody besides just you have it in your safe as far as the letters and whatnot. I told him I'd get around to it.
2015.
I'm getting there. But what I'll actually do is I'll try to put some of this in some type of format I can send to you at least.
Okay.
so you can see some of the period stuff or whatnot. But I appreciate it. It does give me an excuse to go back down memory lane. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. And again, I know what your personal connection with them was, and I thank you for coming on tonight and sharing this with all the people on the internet that will see it and listen to it later.
Yes, sir.
Because it is things that we just have short-term memories now because of the way the world moves so fast, and we just have to remember where we came from.
We do. One of the books I was looking for was The Modern Technique of the Pistol by Greg Morrison, who he actually wrote that as his thesis for his PhD.
Yeah.
That was his thesis project, but he was one of Jeff Cooper's range masters. I think if you look it up on eBay or Amazon, it's like $400 or $500, which is a fraction of what it's actually worth. But I don't know if Gunsite still sells in the pro shop. I was just out there a few months ago, and I didn't even look for it. But it's not. You can't get it on Kindle. This book was written.
I've got a copy of it that I think I got on Kindle.
Let me know if you can find it, because I couldn't find it. What I was getting at is I got to thinking about it the other day, and I didn't know where mine was at. So I text Dick O'Hearn. And because I usually, if somebody has something like that, it's usually Dick has borrowed it. And Lee knows Dick from training and whatnot. But I text him and I said, "Hey, do you have the Modern Technique of the Pistol?" "Yes, I do." "Can I get it back?" "Yes, you can." So it's, what I'm getting at is you can read Jeff Cooper's books, you can read articles and whatnot from him. But if you want to get a true historical view of the modern technique, as far as like a, not historical, but a technical, like a step-by-step view, that's the book you want. It's very, very doctrinal in the way the modern technique was done.
Hardcover on Amazon is $80.17, and paperback is right at $50. I'm pretty sure that once upon a time I got that in a Kindle format. I know I've read the book, and
Yes,
I've got it in some format somewhere. But go ahead
if
with
you
what you.
find it, no, that was it. If you find it, I'm very interested of it, because I've got some of the kernel. I've got all of the originals, and then I've got Lindy, one of his daughters, who runs the Jeff Cooper Legacy Foundation, and I'll shamelessly plug them. Basically, what happens is she doesn't sell anything anymore other than maybe patches, challenge coins, and pins, but it's the Jeff Cooper Legacy Foundation. You can Google search that. You can buy those from her. Used to be able to buy some of the books. The books are all now handled through another venue, but you can donate to them and so on and so forth. And what the Jeff Cooper Legacy Foundation does is it takes people that want to go to Gunsite but cannot afford to, and it gives them an opportunity. So you can go online, you can fill out your application to get a scholarship, and so it's reviewed, and if you meet a certain criteria, then the Jeff Cooper Legacy Foundation will pay for your scholarship at Gunsite. So they've awarded a lot of recipients. You've had military, you've had police, you've had armed citizens, and they paid their tuition out there to keep the memory of Jeff Cooper alive and his teachings. But she did a series of 100, I want to say it was 100 leather bound books. So it's very nice, golden pages, leather bound, very spectacular books. And I've got number 11 of each one of those. And then I've got some of his books on Kindle. But one of the things that I just, from again, standpoint of history, if you want to see the actual technical way the modern technique was done, you want the Modern Technique of the Pistol. So if you find that on electronic format, I'd like to know, because I'd be interested in that.
I just looked through my Kindle library and it's not in there, so it must have been a paperback book that I had. All right. Anything that I didn't ask you about that you would like to mention tonight before we sign off?
Not that I can think of, sir.
All right. And just so we can have 100% track record, we have to mention Eric Galehouse
Oh, he's
because
a gunsight instructor and he wrote for SWAT magazine.
right, and he
And
and he
some
shoots an M&P.
does he? Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
I read a blurb on him taking the SIG Academy pistol mounted optics instructor at Gunsight. He
Uh-huh.
said something about, I think, an M&P and an acro, maybe.
Right. Yeah. That's become an inside joke that Bulky sits and drinks listening to these episodes. Every time he hears Galehouse get mentioned, he has to take a drink. And so I couldn't let him get through an episode without getting a Galehouse swig.
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, Shane, as always, it's fun to talk with you. And I hope our audience enjoys this episode as much as I did. And thank you for everything that you've done for me over the years. Go take a class from this guy, stay away from that guy, and all the conversations that we've had throughout the years have been very beneficial. So thank you for that.
You're welcome, and I appreciate it. I've had a lot. I mean, like well over 10,000 hours worth of training. So I'd rather you as a friend get the best out of the limited time you have. So I appreciate it.
We'll have to do another episode where we go into some of the other training out there.
Yes, sir.
But I thought this would be a good way to get a good um, snapshot of your experiences with Cooper personally.
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, folks, your time is your most important asset, and I thank you for spending your time here with us on the That Weems Guy Show.